I was never supposed to walk into that room that night, and if my plans had not changed at the last minute, I would have never discovered the person who changed the way I saw my own life. My name is Noah Carter, and before that evening, I believed I understood my world completely. My apartment was my quiet place, the one space where I could relax after long days and forget about everything outside. I liked routines, I liked knowing what to expect, and I rarely allowed unexpected situations to interrupt my carefully organized life. That was why what happened that night felt so impossible. I was supposed to be away from home. I had planned to spend the evening helping a friend with a project across town, and I had already accepted that I would not return until the next morning. But plans change. A simple message changed my schedule, and instead of staying out late, I found myself driving back to my apartment earlier than expected. At the time, I thought it was just an ordinary change of plans. I had no idea that arriving home a few hours earlier would introduce me to someone I never expected to meet. When I unlocked my front door, everything seemed normal at first. The lights were exactly how I left them. The apartment was quiet, and nothing appeared unusual. I remember thinking about how nice it felt to be home earlier than planned. But then I noticed something that made me stop. There was a sound coming from my room. For a moment, I stood there trying to understand what I was hearing. My first thought was that maybe I had forgotten something before leaving. Maybe I had left a device running or made some simple mistake. But when I walked closer and looked inside, I realized I was not alone. Someone was there. A man I had never expected to see was standing inside my room. His name was Evan Mitchell, and at that exact moment, I had no idea who he was or why he was there. The strange thing was that he did not look like someone who wanted to create trouble. He seemed just as surprised to see me as I was to see him. We both stood there quietly, trying to understand a situation that made no sense. I had so many questions, but before I could ask any of them, I noticed something about Evan. There was a calmness in the way he looked at me, almost like he knew this moment would eventually happen. That only made me more curious. How did he know about my apartment? Why was he in my room? And what connection could possibly exist between two people who had never met before? The truth was, I had no answers. All I knew was that my normal evening had become something completely unexpected. I had walked through my front door expecting a quiet night at home, but instead, I found a stranger standing in the one place where I felt most comfortable. Looking back now, I realized that moment was the beginning of a story I never could have predicted. At the time, I only saw a mystery. I did not know that behind Evan's unexpected appearance was a story that would change both of us forever. I stood there for several seconds, trying to understand what I was seeing. The person in my room was not someone I recognized. Yet there was something about the situation that felt more complicated than a simple misunderstanding. His name was Evan Mitchell, and the first thing I noticed was that he seemed just as confused as I was. He did not try to avoid my questions, and he did not act like someone who expected this moment to happen. Instead, he looked at me with the same uncertainty I felt. I finally asked the question that had been running through my mind since I opened the door. I asked him who he was and why he was inside my apartment. Evan took a quiet moment before answering. He explained that he understood how strange the situation looked, and he admitted that if he were in my position, he would probably have the same questions. That response caught me off guard because I expected a complicated explanation, but instead, he acknowledged how unusual everything appeared. He told me that there was a reason he was there, but the story behind it was not something that could be explained in a single sentence. I listened carefully because I wanted to understand before making any assumptions. One thing became clear very quickly. Evan was not someone who wanted to hide the truth. He seemed like someone who was trying to find the right way to explain something difficult. I asked him how he even knew about my apartment, and that question seemed to make him pause. He looked around the room for a moment, almost as if he was remembering something connected to the space around him. Then he explained that he had a connection to this place, but not in the way I originally imagined. That answer only created more questions. I had spent years believing I knew everything about my own home. I knew every corner, every routine, and every detail that made the apartment feel like mine. Yet suddenly, there was someone standing inside that space who knew something I did not. The strange part was that instead of feeling angry, I found myself becoming more curious. There was a calmness in Evan's voice that made me want to hear the entire story. He was not trying to force me to accept his explanation immediately. He simply asked me to listen. As we talked, I began to notice small details about him. Evan was thoughtful with his words, and he seemed careful not to make the situation more uncomfortable than it already was. He answered what he could and admitted when he needed time to explain the rest. That honesty made me lower my guard slightly. We moved from my room to the living area, where we could have a more normal conversation. It was a strange feeling sitting there with someone I had never met before, trying to understand how our lives had suddenly crossed in such an unexpected way. Evan told me that he never planned for our first meeting to happen like this. He said that timing had a way of changing everything. At that moment, I still had many unanswered questions. I wanted to know the full reason he was there and what connection brought him into my life. But for the first time since I opened that door, I felt that the answer might be more meaningful than I expected. I thought I was facing a problem that needed to be solved. I did not realize I was beginning a conversation that would reveal a story neither of us saw coming. After Evan and I moved from my room to the living area, the strange feeling of the night slowly began to change. At first, everything about the situation felt impossible to understand. A person I had never met was sitting in my apartment, and I still did not know the full reason behind his unexpected appearance. But as we continued talking, I realized that Evan was not trying to create more questions. He was trying to explain something that was difficult to put into words. I offered him a glass of water, and for a moment, the entire situation felt almost normal. It was strange how quickly a confusing moment could turn into a quiet conversation between two people who had just met. Evan thanked me and said he appreciated my willingness to listen before making any assumptions. That comment stayed with me because it made me realize how easily I could have judged the situation without knowing the truth. I asked him again about his connection to my apartment. This time, he looked around the room and explained that there were details about this place that I did not know. He told me that before I moved in, the apartment had belonged to someone important in his life. That information immediately changed the way I looked around the room. Suddenly, the space that I considered completely familiar felt like it had a history I had never discovered. Evan explained that he did not expect to meet me that night. He had planned to come by earlier, but unexpected changes delayed everything. He said that when he realized I was not supposed to be home, he thought he would have more time to handle what he needed to do quietly. Hearing that made me curious, but I also noticed something important. Evan was not focused on hiding anything. He seemed more concerned about explaining why the situation looked so unusual. I asked him what exactly he had come to find, and he hesitated before answering. He told me that there was something in the apartment that connected to a part of his past he had not fully understood. He had been trying to learn more about it, but he never expected the person living there to come home during that moment. I listened carefully because I started to realize that Evan was not just a stranger who appeared in my room. He was someone who had been carrying unanswered questions of his own. The more he talked, the more I saw a different side of him. Behind his calm personality was someone searching for closure and understanding. I knew what it felt like to have questions about the past, so I could relate to that feeling. I asked Evan why he had not simply explained everything from the beginning. He smiled slightly and admitted that sometimes people struggle to share personal stories with someone they have just met. He said that some experiences are easier to explain after trust begins to develop. That answer made sense to me because I realized I was already starting to trust him more than I expected. The night had started with confusion, but it was slowly becoming a conversation about memories, choices, and the unexpected ways people's lives connect. Before Evan continued his story, I looked around my apartment again. For the first time, I wondered what other stories might exist inside the walls I thought I knew so well. I had always believed my home was simply a place where I lived. But that night, I began to understand that every place has a history, and sometimes the people connected to that history appear when we least expect them. As Evan continued explaining the reason behind his unexpected arrival, I started to see the situation from a completely different perspective. A few hours earlier, I thought I had walked into a mystery that made no sense. I thought I was simply trying to understand why someone was inside my apartment. But now I realized there was a much deeper story connected to this place and the person sitting in front of me. Evan told me that before I moved into the apartment, the space had belonged to someone who had a significant impact on his life. He explained that there were memories connected to the rooms, the furniture, and even small details that most people would never notice. For Evan, this was not just an apartment. It was a place connected to important moments from his past. I listened quietly as he described how difficult it had been to return after so much time had passed. He said that he had spent a long time thinking about whether he should come back or simply leave everything behind. He was not looking for anything valuable or trying to change my life. He only wanted to understand a part of his own story that had remained unfinished. That explanation changed the way I viewed him. Before that conversation, I only knew Evan as the person I found in my room. But as he shared more, I began to see him as someone who was trying to reconnect with a chapter of his life that he never fully closed. I asked him why he never reached out before. Evan admitted that he was not sure how to approach the situation. He did not know who lived there now, and he did not know whether his presence would be welcomed or misunderstood. He said that when people carry memories for a long time, they sometimes create a version of the past in their minds that feels difficult to revisit. I understood what he meant because everyone has moments they remember differently over time. Some places hold emotions that are hard to explain to someone who was not there. Evan told me that he had almost decided not to come that night, but something made him believe he needed to finally take that step. The unexpected timing of my return was not something he planned, but it forced both of us into a conversation that might never have happened otherwise. I found it interesting how quickly my feelings about the situation had changed. At first, I wanted simple answers. I wanted to know who he was and why he was in my room. But now I wanted to understand his story. There was something honest about the way he spoke. He was not trying to make himself look perfect, and he was not pretending that the situation was simple. He was just sharing his experience and hoping I could understand. As we continued talking, I started thinking about how many stories exist around us that we never notice. Every home, every neighborhood, and every person carries memories that are invisible to others. We often see only the present moment, without knowing what happened before we arrived. Before that night, I thought my apartment was only my own space. But meeting Evan showed me that every place can hold pieces of someone else's journey. And sometimes, those hidden pieces find their way back into our lives at the exact moment we need to discover them. As the night continued, I found myself sitting across from Evan with a feeling I never expected to have when I first opened that door. The confusion was still there, but it had been replaced by curiosity and understanding. I no longer saw him as someone who had entered my space without explanation. I saw him as someone carrying a story that had been waiting for the right moment to be told. Evan continued sharing details about his connection to the apartment, and I began to understand why returning to this place meant so much to him. He explained that some memories are attached to places in ways people cannot easily describe. A familiar room, a certain corner, or even a small detail can bring back emotions connected to moments that shaped a person's life. For Evan, this apartment represented a part of his past that he had never fully processed. He told me that he had avoided coming back for a long time because he was unsure what he would feel once he saw the place again. I understood that hesitation because there are moments in everyone's life that feel easier to leave untouched. Sometimes people believe that moving forward means forgetting what happened before. But Evan had realized that understanding the past was not the same as living in it. It was about accepting the experiences that helped create the person he had become. As he spoke, I noticed that Evan was not only sharing facts. He was sharing emotions that he had probably kept private for a long time. He described how certain memories could remain with someone even when years passed. He talked about how people often change, but the moments that influence them continue to be part of their story. That idea made me think about my own life. I had always viewed my apartment as a place where my current story happened. I never considered that it had been part of someone else's important memories before I arrived. It was strange to realize that the same walls could represent completely different things to two different people. I asked Evan if he regretted coming back. He looked around the room before answering. He said that he was not sure when he first arrived, but after talking with me, he felt that coming back had been the right decision. He explained that sometimes people need unexpected moments to help them see things differently. I appreciated his honesty because I realized the same thing had happened to me. Before that evening, I thought I was simply dealing with an unusual situation. But now, I was learning something about another person's journey and also discovering new things about myself. Evan then asked me a question that surprised me. He asked if I ever wondered about the stories behind the places I passed every day. I admitted that I usually did not. Like most people, I focused on my own responsibilities and rarely thought about the experiences connected to other people's lives. Evan smiled and said that maybe this was why certain encounters stayed with us. They reminded us that the world was filled with stories we would never know unless we took the time to listen. As the conversation continued, the apartment no longer felt like a place where something strange had happened. Instead, it felt like a place where two people had shared something meaningful. The mystery that brought Evan there was slowly becoming less important than the connection created afterward. When I finally looked at the clock, I realized that hours had passed since I walked through the door. I had expected to spend a quiet evening alone, but instead, I had spent the night learning about someone whose life had crossed with mine in the most unexpected way. And I knew that whatever happened next, I would never look at that room the same way again. As the conversation with Evan continued, I realized that the most important part of the night was no longer the mystery of how he entered my apartment. The question that once filled my mind had slowly changed into something different. I was no longer only wondering why he was there. I wanted to understand who he was and what experiences had brought him to that moment. Evan had a quiet way of explaining things. He never rushed his words, and he never tried to make his story sound more dramatic than it was. He simply shared his memories honestly, and that made it easier for me to listen. He told me more about the person who had once lived in the apartment before me and why that connection mattered so much. He explained that some people leave behind more than objects. They leave behind lessons, memories, and moments that continue to influence the people who knew them. For Evan, returning to this place was not about holding on to the past. It was about understanding how those experiences shaped the person he had become. I asked him if he had been thinking about coming back for a long time. He smiled and admitted that the idea had stayed in his mind for years. He had imagined many different possibilities, but he never expected the situation to happen this way. He never expected to meet me during the process. That answer made me think about how unpredictable life can be. We often imagine important moments happening in perfect circumstances, but sometimes they happen during the most unexpected situations. Evan told me that he had learned an important lesson over the years. He said that people often wait for the right time to have conversations they know they need to have. They wait because they are uncertain, nervous, or afraid of how things might change. But sometimes waiting too long only creates more distance. Hearing that made me reflect on my own choices. I realized that I had spent a lot of time avoiding situations that required me to be more open. I preferred comfort and routine because they felt safe. But meeting Evan showed me that unexpected moments could also bring something valuable. During our conversation, Evan asked me about my life and what made me choose this apartment. I told him that I had liked the space because it felt peaceful. I enjoyed having a place where I could relax and feel comfortable after busy days. Evan nodded and said he understood because places often become meaningful because of the feelings people attach to them. A home is not only made of rooms and furniture. It is made of experiences, conversations, and memories. That idea stayed with me because it changed the way I looked at my own apartment. Before that night, I saw it as a place that belonged only to my present. But after hearing Evan's story, I realized that every place has layers of history that exist beyond what we can see. As the night moved forward, the distance between us became smaller. We started as two strangers connected by an unusual situation, but we were slowly becoming two people who understood each other. Evan admitted that he had expected the night to be uncomfortable, but talking with me made him realize that maybe returning was exactly what he needed. I told him that I never expected to meet anyone that evening, especially not someone who would make me question the way I viewed ordinary moments. When I finally looked outside and noticed how late it had become, I realized something important. The person I discovered in my room was no longer just a mystery to solve. He was a person with a story, and somehow that story had become connected to mine. The night I met Evan changed the way I looked at unexpected moments. What began as a confusing situation slowly became a conversation that I knew I would remember for a long time. But even after hearing his story and understanding why he returned to the apartment, I still felt there were parts of Evan that I did not know yet. There were details he had not shared, not because he was trying to hide them, but because some parts of a person's life take time to explain. Over the following days, I found myself thinking about our conversation more than I expected. I thought about how strange it was that two people with completely different lives could meet under such unusual circumstances and somehow find common ground. Evan and I stayed in contact after that night. Our conversations started simply with short messages and casual updates, but they gradually became longer. We talked about everyday things, personal experiences, and the small moments that shaped who we were. I noticed that Evan had a different way of seeing life. He paid attention to details that most people ignored. He believed that every person carried a story, even if the world only saw a small part of it. One afternoon, we talked about how people often make assumptions based on first impressions. I admitted that when I first saw him in my room, I immediately created a story in my mind about who he was and why he was there. Evan smiled and said that everyone does that. Sometimes. He explained that the human mind naturally tries to fill in missing information when something does not make sense. But the problem was that those assumptions were not always fair. I thought about that because it was exactly what had happened between us. I had seen a situation without knowing the reason behind it. Once I understood the truth, my entire perspective changed. Evan told me that he had experienced similar moments throughout his life. People often noticed one part of him and assumed they understood everything. They saw his quiet personality and thought they knew what kind of person he was. But there was always more beneath the surface. I understood that feeling because I had spent years doing something similar. I allowed people to see only the parts of myself that felt comfortable to share. I rarely talked about uncertainty, dreams, or the things I was still trying to figure out. During one conversation, Evan asked me if I believed people could enter our lives for a reason. I thought about the question before answering. I said that I used to believe everything happened according to a clear plan, but after meeting him, I was not so sure anymore. Sometimes people appear at unexpected times and create changes we never planned for. Evan agreed and said that maybe the most meaningful connections are not the ones we search for. They are the ones we recognize when they arrive. That idea stayed with me because it perfectly described our situation. Neither of us planned to meet that night. Neither of us expected a simple evening to become something important. Yet somehow, that unexpected moment created a connection that continued growing. As I got to know Evan better, I realized that the mystery surrounding him was never the most important part of the story. The real story was about two people learning to understand each other. It was about looking beyond appearances and discovering the person behind the first impression. And slowly, I began to realize that Evan was no longer someone connected to my apartment's past. He had become someone connected to my present. As my friendship with Evan continued to grow, I began to realize that the most meaningful part of our connection was not the unusual way we met. It was the way we both changed after that moment. Before Evan entered my life, I had become comfortable with routines that kept everything predictable. I worked, handled responsibilities, and enjoyed the quiet of my own space. There was nothing wrong with that, but I had forgotten how valuable it was to share experiences with someone else. Evan brought a different energy into my life. He reminded me that conversations could create new perspectives and that people could influence us in ways we never expect. One evening, Evan and I sat together talking about the choices we had made over the years. We discussed how small decisions often shaped our future without us realizing it. Evan mentioned that if he had made one different choice years earlier, he might have never returned to the apartment and we might have never met. That thought stayed with me because it showed how many moments in life are connected by circumstances we cannot predict. Evan told me that for a long time, he struggled with the idea of moving forward while still carrying memories from the past. He believed that leaving certain experiences behind was the only way to grow. But eventually, he learned that accepting the past was different from being trapped by it. Understanding where we come from helps us understand where we want to go. I appreciated hearing that because I had also spent years trying to create a future without always acknowledging the things that shaped me. Our conversations became a place where we could be honest without feeling pressured to have perfect answers. That was something I valued about Evan. He never acted like he had everything figured out. Instead, he was comfortable admitting that he was still learning, still changing, and still discovering new parts of himself. I think that honesty was one of the reasons I trusted him. During another conversation, Evan asked me if I ever thought about how different my life would be if I had not returned home that night. I laughed because it was impossible to know. Maybe everything would have continued exactly the same. Maybe we would have remained strangers forever. But the fact that one unexpected change created such a meaningful connection made me appreciate how unpredictable life could be. I told Evan that meeting him had reminded me to be more open to experiences outside my usual routine. He said he felt the same way. He explained that he had spent a long time thinking certain moments had to happen in a specific way, but now he understood that some of the best experiences come from situations we never plan. As we talked, I noticed how different things felt compared to the first night. Back then, Evan was a mystery inside my home. Now he was someone I trusted and respected. The room where we first met no longer represented confusion or uncertainty. Instead, it represented the beginning of a friendship that neither of us expected. Looking back, I realized that the biggest change was not discovering why Evan was there. The biggest change was discovering what happened after that moment. Two people who were once complete strangers found understanding through simple conversations, patience, and the willingness to see beyond first impressions. And as I thought about everything that had happened, I knew that our story was no longer about an unexpected arrival. It was about what can happen when people choose to listen, understand, and allow a new connection to become part of their lives. When I think back to the night Evan and I first met, I realized that the person I found in my room was not just an unexpected visitor. He was the beginning of a chapter one never knew I needed. At that moment, I thought I was facing a strange situation that required answers. I wanted to understand who Evan was, why he was there, and how someone I had never met could suddenly become part of my life. But as time passed, I learned that the most important part of that night was not the mystery itself. It was everything that happened afterward. Evan and I continued talking, and our friendship grew through countless small moments. We shared stories, experiences, and thoughts that we had rarely shared with other people. What made our connection special was not that we always agreed or had the same perspective. It was that we were willing to listen and understand each other. Evan reminded me that every person has a story that cannot be discovered from a single moment or first impression. Before meeting him, I often moved through life without questioning the routines I had created. I focused on responsibilities and the things I needed to accomplish. I believed that staying organized and predictable was the best way to feel comfortable. But knowing Evan changed that. He showed me that unexpected moments could bring experiences that were impossible to plan. He taught me that sometimes the people who enter our lives unexpectedly can help us discover parts of ourselves that we have ignored. Evan also changed the way I viewed the past. I used to think that moving forward meant leaving everything behind. But through his story, I learned that our memories are not obstacles. They are pieces of who we become. Understanding where we came from allows us to appreciate where we are now. The apartment that once felt like nothing more than a place I lived became a reminder of that lesson. It was a space that connected two different stories at a moment when neither of us expected it. Years from now, I know I will still remember that evening. Not because someone was unexpectedly there, but because that moment introduced me to a person who changed my perspective. Evan entered my life through a situation neither of us planned, but he stayed because we discovered something meaningful in our conversations. We found trust, respect, and a connection that grew naturally over time. Looking back, I understand that life does not always announce the moments that will matter most. Sometimes the experiences that change us begin quietly. They start with a simple conversation, an unexpected encounter, or a person who appears when we least expect it. The biggest lessons often come from situations we never imagined experiencing. For me, meeting Evan was a reminder that every person we encounter has the potential to teach us something valuable. We never truly know what stories are waiting behind the people around us. We never know when a stranger might become someone important. And we never know how one unexpected moment can completely change the way we see the world. What began as a confusing evening became one of the most meaningful connections of my life. Evan was not just someone connected to a hidden part of my apartment's history. He became someone connected to my own story, and that was something I never could have predicted.